I want to echo Fran's expression of appreciation for Walter and staff, and to those of you who came out today. So, today I want to situate the effort to use the exhibition of Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America to achieve a degree of racial reconciliation into this issue of post-racialism. Lynching is a form of extralegal violence that typically involves individuals or groups who choose to step outside the boundaries of the legal system to violently exact justice, while purporting to be operating in conjunction with the legal system and thereby exempt from prosecution. Research suggests that between 1880 and 1940, more than 4,000 people were lynched across the country. Most of the victims in the former slaveholding states were African-American men who were killed in a larger white supremacist campaign designed to check black people's efforts to transcend slavery. Most of the killings were quiet, private affairs, but others involved public execution. Of all of the lynchings that occurred, only a few were photographed because of the general secrecy of the violence and the limited photographic technology over the span of the history of lynching. Even though white Southerners' communal support for black subjugation made lynching possible, most whites viewed photographic souvenirs of lynching in private spaces. After lynching declined, the photographs disappeared into the basements and closets of American homes, occasionally surfacing in flea markets and estate sales. From 2000 through 2010, a photography exhibit called Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America traveled around the United States. The exhibit featured photographic materials collected by a man named James Allen. The subject of most of the photographs were lynch sufferers, who were mostly black and white men and some black women. Many of the other images focus on members of the crowd, who were mostly white perpetrators and white people who came to witness the aftermath of the killings. At the time, many historians, museum curators, journalists, and visitors hailed the exhibition of Without Sanctuary material. They argued that the memorabilia of photographs provided irrefutable proof of lynching's existence in the United States. Some even suggested that the exhibit was the potion needed to erase the amnesia that many Americans have about lynching and its impact on race relations. This specific argument for exhibiting Without Sanctuary materials to help Americans remember and understand lynching occurred within the context of a global push for reconciliation, as peoples, communities, and even countries tried to cope with recent or historic violence and genocide. Rather than focus solely on legal retribution or financial reparations, reconciliation is promoted what some called restorative justice. A process of reconciliation achieved by having a public, and so restorative justice is this process of reconciliation achieved by having a public accounting for the human transgressions that occurred as a way of promoting healing. The objective of these efforts at reconciliation involved truth-telling, compensation, and healing, were designed to develop a better understanding of the harm done so that people, communities, and countries where these conflicts occurred could move forward toward reconciliation. Without Sanctuary, in other words, were supposed to help Americans work through this process and heal the racialized wounds of the past. Rather than heal the wounds, I argue that Without Sanctuary created this phenomenon that I call the lynching show. The lynching show involved this public elaboration on lynching and racial violence that scholars, journalists, museum curators in the United States promoted as a way to facilitate healing and racial reconciliation. As a scholar who researched lynching, who participated in scholarly debates about lynching, who even attended or visited the exhibits in Atlanta and Detroit, I was always skeptical about the value of exhibiting lynching photography. I believe that after experiencing Without Sanctuary, Americans would certainly know that lynching occurred, but not much more than that. So I wanted to know, and that's what I studied, that's what I started to examine for the grant. So I wanted to know, did Without Sanctuary help us get a step closer to racial reconciliation? To answer this and other questions, I decided to go right to the heart of evidentiary evidence, the comment books that Without Sanctuary exhibitors provided for visitors to sign after they finished viewing the exhibit. From July 2004 through March 2005, the Wright Museum exhibited materials from the Without Sanctuary collection. The exhibit, which they titled Bearing Witness, Bearing Our Souls, presented an education about lynching in America in two parts. The first part was the historical display of the photographs. The second part, and it was something that was new for the exhibit, included a detailed history of the anti-lynching crusades. People came by the thousands. The museum staff put out 3-ring binders full of blank sheets inviting visitors to, quote, give us your comments about the exhibit. And they did. In fact, so many people chose to leave their reflections and reactions that the staff repeatedly had to empty the binders and replace filled comment sheets with new blank ones. After 8 months, the pages and comment cards the staff collected filled 4 archival boxes. The result, which is good and bad, is more than 10,000 comments that I have been trying to collect, examine, and transcribe. For this talk, I decided to use a sample of 762 comments that visitors left in the first 2 months of the exhibit to discuss the larger issue of racial reconciliation. But before I get into my analysis, let me give you a little summary of the data. Only about 40% of the commenting visitors identified themselves by name. About 30% identified their age, their sex, their racial, ethnic, national, or religious backgrounds. Even if visitors did not provide personal information, some of the information they did provide lets us know who they were and from whence they came. Visitors identified themselves as coming from as nearby as Detroit Public Schools to as far away as Nottingham, England. Visitors represented the panorama of the United States. They were young and they were old. They included people from most racial and ethnic groups. They came as individuals, and they also came as groups, like the Upward Bound students from Illinois, and several families attending their annual reunions here in Detroit. About a third of the visitors indicated that they had some familiarity with the history of lynching and racial violence. Of those who knew the history, they learned it from a variety of sources. Some indicated that they came of age in the Jim Crow South, so they were familiar with the legacy of racial violence. Others learned about lynching from family members. There have been men lynched in my family, one person wrote. And this person identified a man named Ernest Love, who was killed in the 1930s in Bigelow, Arkansas. 14-year-old Michaela explained, my mom has been waiting to see this exhibit for years. My mom has talked to me about lynching all the time. Seeing it is another thing. Michael A. McNeil noted, having my mother tell me of her experiences of traveling with her father, who was a black undertaker in Chickasha, I can't pronounce that wrong, Oklahoma, makes this exhibit come alive for me. For about 2/3 of the visitors, the exhibition provided new information. The comments written by these visitors suggested they felt the exhibit helped to explain the world created by national and racial past in which lynching occurred. Specifically, some viewers seemed to express a sense that something other than slavery had left a great stamp or imprint on race relations. Other viewers had generalized knowledge of anti-black racism's existence, but they did not fully appreciate the violence used to subjugate black people. For these people, the photographs seemed to fill a gap in the American narrative. The exhibit had been promoted as a way of achieving racial reconciliation, but only about 1/4 of the visitors in the first 2 months addressed the issue of reconciliation directly. Some visitors suggested that they believed that healing was possible. For example, Herman May III wrote, "It is time for us to come together." Another person wrote, "I hope to God this exhibit will somehow be a healing for the black population because it tells of our pain For whites, I hope it propels them to seek out blacks and to begin to talk about our painful history. Others, like a woman named Ida Johnson, were more skeptical. How can a people forget this or get over it? Johnson asked. A person who identified themselves as LBSA inquired, how can there be healing when no one who committed the crimes will come forward? Another person wrote, I don't know if there can be any healing in our race for this. The damage just runs too deep. In the end, there's no real consensus on whether or not racial reconciliation was possible, but there are threads in the comments that sort of give you an indication of what people think is possible. So, did the constructed effort to add the history of lynching to the American collective memory work? Yes. I think people know about lynching. They know that it occurred. We can sort of, I think if you poll people on the streets, you can get a sense that, yes, they have an understanding that lynching is something that happened in the United States. We also know that lynching happened from the string of noose incidents that occurred between 2005 and 2007. We also know that more people know about lynching because of the lynching reenactments that are occurring in different parts of the South, the clandestine, so they're clearly not advertising. But the word on the underground is that that is something that's going on. Did the exhibition of lynching photography help Americans to get closer to racial reconciliation or to the post-racial state that we are here to discuss? I'm inclined to say no. The lynching show educated Americans that lynching occurred, and it might have shown some light on its relationship to race relations. Indeed, the response to the exhibit informed the development of resolutions in which the Senate issued a formal apology for its role in blocking federal anti-lynching legislation. However, it did not heal the wounds of the past, and it did not help Americans get beyond race, which is one of the unexamined issues in the discussion of post-racialism. The drumbeat of post-racialism regarding blacks and whites began in the 1990s after racial tensions flared over the Rodney King verdict and the O.J. Simpson trial. It got louder, of course, during the 2008 election. For many Americans, the election of a black president seemed to represent an event that would wipe away the historical residue of slavery, lynching, and Jim Crow, and deliver the United States to a state of national racial nirvana. But even the differences in how many Americans imagine the possibilities of an Obama administration are revealing of the thoughts that are informed by racial experience. And the point that I was going to make, just sort of reiterate some of the points that Fran made in terms of the ways that whites and blacks might have thought about the election of Obama, so I won't sort of go into that. What I will say is that many, though not all blacks, do not believe that we have achieved a post-racial era. And many question whether it is even possible for Americans to, quote, get beyond race. The civil rights movement certainly moved the nation closer to a racially egalitarian promised land. Indeed, without the movement, we would probably not be here discussing this topic. And a good portion of the audience would not be present to actually do so. For all that the movement changed, it did not erase systemic structural racism. It did not erase the thinking that black people are inferior to white people and must be subjugated, and the actions that spring from that thinking. But again, it's 2012, it's not the same thing as 1920 or 1950. The racism is not as overt as it was back then, but the threads of it are there and surface enough in the daily lives of black folks and in the occasional realm of popular culture or media to make us question this idea of post-racialism. Another issue that was not addressed in the discussions of post-racialism, but that showed up in the comments, is the fact that lynching and racial violence left deep and irreparable wounds on the people and in the communities in which they occurred. Lynchers killed black Southerners in some of the most heinous ways. They robbed families of not only their loved ones, but also their homes, their property, and their jobs. There was no opportunity for these people to get justice, recourse, or restitution, because the larger community of whites across the country supported the practice. And even if some whites rejected lynching, too many failed to take action to try to end it. Many members of the media and the legal system were complicit in the killings and sometimes played an active role in it. And so one of the unspoken legacies of this history of violence is its calcification of many black people's anger, fear, and distrust of unfamiliar white people. W.E.B. Du Bois captures the sense of fear and distrust in The Souls of White Folk, not the souls of black folk, the souls of white folk, which is a lesser known piece. When he explained that the rise of racial disfranchisement, segregation, and violence in the late 19th century forced him to look anew at white people. Of them, I am singularly clairvoyant, he wrote. I see in and through them. I see them from unusual points of vantage. I see their souls undressed, and from the back and the side. I know the workings of their entrails. I know them, and they know that I know. African Americans who lived during this period had to carry themselves in a particular way, to see in and through white people and to view them from unusual points of vantage, to try to figure out their intentions and whether they might harm or kill them. They passed this information on to subsequent generations. And indeed, honest conversations with and amongst African Americans reveal that many of them are still trying to see the souls of any new white people they encounter. African Americans do not necessarily always feel that they'll be killed in these encounters with new white folk, but they've been socialized to allow for the possibility that a white person might not destroy their life, but maybe their property, their career, or their livelihood. The problem is that they do not really know, so the instinct is to assume guilt until innocence is proven. The idea that we live in a post-racial era does not address this and a host of other issues. I mean, how could it? Rarely have the proponents of post-racialism really tried to acknowledge or address the lived consequences of a history of violent racialization. Indeed, they focus on the destruction of some of the most overt forms of racism. They operate from the position that things such as the social, emotional, and financial effects of African Americans' 300-year history of violent racialization are things to be gotten over rather than acknowledged and reckoned with. Bearing witness to the violence is only the start of a much longer process of understanding and reckoning with the past.
Okay, questions? Yes.
Professor Williams, I have a question. Basically, isn't the same thing happening today in 2012, just more overtly, more legally, with the drug laws, with things that's happening in today's society?
In terms of it fitting into a larger pattern of racialization,
yes,
yes, I would say that there are threads that exist for today, but I would not say that they are. I wouldn't necessarily draw like a direct line between what's happening today and lynching. I know that some people might, but I actually don't. I draw a very clear distinction.
Yes.
I saw the exhibit at the Child Right Museum,
Yeah.
and it was so powerful.
Could you stand up so I can hear you?
I saw the exhibit
Yes.
at the Child Right Museum.
Right.
It was very powerful, moving, scary, touching, sad, and real. So the post-racial era, the question is, why, I mean, why even have this if it wasn't here? Why have a post-racial era? Because it's all still here, is what I'm saying. The lynching, not necessarily that way, because you know, you can do lynching in different forms too, not just physical. It could be physical lynching. It could be different types of cutting people up and doing things to destroy their lives. Like Detroit with this takeover madness. And I'm just saying that when I saw the lecture, the post-racial era, I said, is Wayne? I'm not getting it.
Well,
right.
Well, I think what you sort of notice, and I'll just sort of say this quickly, the post-racial era with a big question mark.
Right.
You know, I don't think that, I haven't heard anyone, and I've been here since 9, I haven't heard anyone say that we are in a post-racial era. I think, you know, the question mark signals that people are questioning, they're interrogating this popular discourse that exists in certain circles, that we are now in a post-racial era. And, you know, the point that I made is that people sort of argued that displaying or showing without sanctuary was going to be just one of the things that we needed to do as a country to move past and move beyond race or heal. And my argument is that people know that lynching occurred, but knowing that lynching occurred isn't the same thing as understanding the effects, the immediate effects on the actual victims and the long-term effects in terms of how Black people often look at white people.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I have a question concerning the ramifications on younger children. In the comments that you sampled, especially like with middle school, high school students, that you could actually identify, what were some of your ideas? What if you generalize your statements possibly?
Right, yes, and that's a great question. I didn't talk about that in this piece. I actually started working on the talk, and then it turned into be 2 hours long, so I had to cut it down. And so and one of the things I discussed, I devoted like about 2 pages to the issue of children, because there was a question about whether or not children should actually be in the exhibit. And like the Free Press, for example, interviewed a lot of psychologists from the area, and they were kind of all over the fence. Some people said, well, yes, you know, there's no age, it's too early for people to start to learn about their path. And then there are other people who said, maybe. But what you see is that parents brought their children, schools still brought kids to see it. But even on some of the comment pages, kids, instead of writing comments, they just drew pictures. And so like that just sort of gives you a sense of, you know, part of what's going on. I think that, like the adults, many of the children were overwhelmed. They were sort of overwhelmed by a lot of the information, but some of their takeaways were quite revealing, especially of the tweens. The tweens seem to have written more comments than the older teens. And I'm not sure what's going on there, like the older teens might not have written. And what's also interesting is that more of the young females wrote than the young males wrote. Yeah, you know, and so like, you know, so there are all of these things to interrogate. But for for some of the young people, it was, you know, statements like, they didn't have to kill us, I didn't know that this happened, I would hate to have lived during this time period, it makes me, and it's sort of depending on like their age, it makes me rethink when I complain about my life. It makes me understand what my grandparents, my great-grandparents might have went through. I'm so glad they were strong enough to get through it, because I don't think I could. So look, there are a lot of comments from the young people who attended, but I do want to spend a little bit more time just really trying to analyze it, because sometimes the young people, especially K-12 students, younger K-12 students, they identify themselves by age or by grade. And sometimes they'll put their school like the Delta Academy or something like that. So sometimes they go that far, but other times it's not clear, you know, their age. But for the ones where I can sort of really identify their age, I really, I think that that's an incredible opportunity to understand what knowledge they brought to the exhibit and then what they came away with. Sorry. Thank you.
I just are we going? Okay, she's called.
I didn't see this call.
You get it back? Send it.
Stand up, please.
I also went to see this when I was in middle school, and I'm sorry, I went to see the exhibit when I was in middle school in Atlanta, and I went to an African Center school, so I kind of knew all about lynching and stuff. My parents kind of taught me about that, so just the experience of it, like she said, it was kind of real, and it was very emotional for me. But at the same time, I just wanted to ask you, like, wow, it's not just a sense of getting over the, you know, the racial issues of America. Do you feel like it's kind of revealing how, like the racial status of America today, like how Americans, you know, how we view, how you know, blacks view race, or, you know, it's just the status of race in America. Do you feel like it's, you know, has a part in that, or had a part in that?
Are you asking, do I think that things have improved, or do I think that...
No, the exhibit revealed that.
I think that the exhibit, I think it did sort of wake people up from a lack of knowledge. One of the quotes that I didn't read was, it was a statement by a person who identified himself as a white male. And again, he says he had an understanding that racism existed, but he didn't really understand, you know, it in practice. And so some people understood lynching as something, as racism, instead of it being in the abstract, but something in practice. And so they were able to make a connection in that way. And, you know, I do think, you know, as I've said before, that people now have an understanding that lynching occurred. And that it was real. I think a number of people who wrote comments, and 2 people today have highlighted the fact that it was something real, it was something concrete. They could look at the photograph and they could see it. And that might not have been something that they had been able to do before, but it's certainly something that they could do during the exhibit.
Your question?
Evan.
Dr. Williams, I was wondering if any of the respondents mentioned personal histories. One of the things that I'm always curious about when it comes to lynching is that many African Americans, our ancestors were lynched, but there was sort of this conspiracy of silence among the dominant population of the time, where it wasn't talked about in the mainstream. But while Ida B. Wells and others were talking about it, family histories, I had to figure out the reason why I sit here in Detroit, I'm a native Detroiter, is because my great-grandfather was lynched. And his son was a baby at the time. My great-uncles and my grandfather never talked about this incident, which must have been horrifically traumatic. And so I'm wondering, because, you know, the difference between, I have some very, very good friends who are Jewish and who are young scholars studying the Holocaust. There wasn't this sort of 2-generation break in that narrative. So I'm just so curious about 2 generations later, after sort of the nadir period of race relations, if you got any of that in the comments, where people are personalizing the experience, or are they just generalizing on a racial basis?
Well, I would say there's both. And the answer to larger answer to your question is I addressed that in my book, in the sense that it's testing the subtitle is African Americans' Testimonies about Violence, and so it's the fact that they testify before Congress, they write the president, they write the Department of Justice, they tell what happened, they explain what happened to their friends, families, and neighbors. So there is this, the problem is that people passed on knowledge within their families, but they might not have written it down. So as a historian, it would be a little bit more difficult to trace. So people talked about it at the time, but for some people there was a sense of, like they exercised agency in a different way. It's like, I'm not going to talk about this absolutely devastating event. I'm not going to pass this knowledge on. Other people, they wanted to talk about it because they're still processing what happened to themselves and, still trying to rebuild their world, so they're going to talk about it. But then there are other people who just say, I don't want to talk about it. I can't talk about it. I can't, and even the language they use, I can't really find the words. And there's also the acknowledgement of it's not necessarily safe to talk about it. Yes. I mean, even people who testified before Congress, one of the things that they mentioned in 1870 and 1871 and in 1880 is that, well, you see more in the people who testified in 1880. Look, the people who testified before this body the last time, they were killed. Mm-hmm. And so, there's an understanding that there's a great danger of testifying, but many African Americans know that there's a danger of testifying, but then there are other people who say we need to make the world know what happened to us. So I would say it's not cut and dry. It's not that other groups talk about horrific experiences and African Americans don't. I would say that they do, but it really depends. It's situational. It depends on the person. It depends on how devastated they were by the event, whether or not people in the family or in the neighborhood believed them, whether they felt safe to talk about it. It's all of those variables, so it's not concrete either way. So.
I feel we've run out of time, so either or. Or you can find some time during the break. We really show that time.
Oh, the title is They Left Great Marks on Me. It's on, you can get it on Amazon. I have like 2 copies in my car.
But we have a 10-minute break, so you find some time to come in and join us. I'm so sorry.
So sorry. Thank you.
But let's give a big hand.